24. Dezember 1944, Germany, Ruhr Valley. In the dead of night, 1,000 tons of American bombs descended from the sky. The target, Germany's beating industrial heart. Below, the mighty munitions factory that powered the Nazi war machine was about to feel the fury of precision B-17, flying fortresses sliced through the darkness, their crews locked in. The countdown was brutal and final, bombs away. The factory workers had no idea what was coming. Just moments before impact, the ground began to shake. Then, boom! The explosion lit up the night. As the wreckage fell, the Luftwaffe scrambled into the air. But it was too late. There, and just like that, in the span of a heartbeat, one of Germany's most vital industrial lifelines was reduced to rubble. What happens when the very machines that power a war are suddenly crippled? What does it mean when precision targeting leaves nothing but ash and devastation? Hold your breath as we dive into the chaos that changed the course of the war forever. The war had shifted. No longer were the tides determined solely by the forces clashing on the front lines. Instead, the fight had moved deeper into the industrial heart of Germany. The Ruhr Valley, a region once considered impenetrable due to its crucial production facilities, now found itself under direct attack. The stakes couldn't have been higher: destroy the industrial base of Nazi Germany, and the war would falter. Every piece of machinery, every bomb that fell, aimed at the very lifeblood of the German war effort. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies, its pilots and aircraft viewed as near invincible. But in the wake of the continuous American bombing raids, even the Luftwaffe's formidable defenses began to crumble. These raids were no longer scattershot attempts at disrupting military logistics. They were highly coordinated strikes aimed at crippling the very heart of Germany's industrial might. As the B-17 Flying Fortress Squadron began its run over the Ruhr Valley, the American crews knew their mission was one of utter importance. Their target was a munitions plant responsible for supplying much of the artillery, aircraft parts, and tanks that fueled Germany's war machine. In the dead of night, the B-17 seconds cut through the darkness, their bomb doors creaking open to release their deadly cargo. As the first bombs hit the factory, the explosion was unlike any before. The sound was deafening, shaking the very foundations of the valley. A brilliant flash of light illuminated the sky as the factory's walls crumbled under the weight of the attack. The Luftwaffe, having learned of the incoming American strike, scrambled desperately into the air, but it was already too late. Their fighters, while fast and heavily armed, were no match for the precision and firepower of the American bombers. The B-17 seconds soared out of the chaos, leaving behind nothing but smoldering ruins. In the wake of the attack, the factory's production lines ground to a halt. Munitions that could have taken days or weeks to manufacture were destroyed in minutes. The German military, already stretched thin on multiple fronts, found itself without one of its most important sources of war material. The Luftwaffe pilots, who had once felt invincible in their sky-high positions, now realized that even their powerful defenses could not stop the precision of the American bombing. The shock was immediate. German leadership, once confident in their ability to repel air raids, began to grasp the enormity of the threat posed by America's ability to strike with pinpoint accuracy. The repercussions of this bombing campaign went beyond just a few destroyed buildings or factory floors. It shattered the myth that Germany's industrial infrastructure was invulnerable. The American raids had successfully infiltrated Germany's industrial heart, leaving the country exposed. What had once seemed like an unbeatable fortress of steel and firepower now lay in ruins, with factories incapable of restocking or replacing what had been lost. In the aftermath, the German command struggled to react. Even though they launched counterattacks and tried to bolster their defenses, the Americans continued to adapt. They sent waves of bombers, perfected their precision targeting, and used the time between raids to gather intelligence on the enemy's recovery capabilities. Germany could not keep up. The shock of the raid was compounded by the realization that the Allies were now in control of the skies, and their technological advantage was only growing. For the American crews, each mission was just another step in a larger strategy to cripple the Axis war effort. There was no celebration, no moment of victory, just another bombing run, another objective to complete. But for the German soldiers and officers who watched their once proud industrial war machine crumble, the consequences were far graver. The damage was not just in the destruction of buildings and machinery. It was in the crushing blow to morale and the deepening realization that Germany's ability to sustain the war was fading. As night fell over the valley, silence descended once more, but it was not the peace of victory or respite. It was the heavy silence of a wounded beast, staggering from blow to blow. The Luftwaffe's planes had already been sent to intercept the next wave of American bombers. But they were now fighting an enemy they could not see, a war waged not just in the skies, but in the very factories that powered their war effort. And with each raid, the belief that their industrial base was indestructible was further shattered, replaced by a fear that the end was now nearer than anyone could have predicted. In the streets of Berlin, the reality of the war's changing nature was beginning to sink in. The bombing raids would continue. The industrial lifeblood of Germany was being bled dry, one precise strike at a time. The myth of German invulnerability was crumbling, and with it, their chance at a victory they had once thought certain. The war had evolved into something far more than battles for territory and front lines. The industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the Ruhr Valley, had become a prime target for the Allied forces, and the most potent weapon in their arsenal wasn't just on the ground or in the skies. It was precision bombing. This strategic shift marked a pivotal moment in the war. If the Allies could cripple Germany's ability to produce weapons, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition, they could collapse the entire Nazi war. Germany's industrial might had been the backbone of its military. The Ruhr Valley, home to a vast network of factories, was the lifeblood of the Nazi war machine. Here, critical materials were produced that fueled every aspect of the German military, from the infamous Tiger tanks to the powerful Messerschmitt aircraft. Steel mills, oil refineries, and munitions factories churned out weapons of war at an astonishing rate. The sheer scale of this industrial power had been one of the primary reasons for the Nazis' initial success in the early years of the war. But as the Allies ramped up their bombing campaigns, the invincibility of this industrial fortress began to falter. It wasn't just that these factories produced weapons, they were the nerve centers of Germany's entire war effort. Without the factories of the Ruhr Valley, the Nazis could not produce the tanks, planes, or ammunition they needed to fight on the multiple fronts of the war. The sheer volume of production was staggering, and the Germans had made their factories a priority, fortifying them with layers of air defense and strategic positioning. These factories were not only the bombing raids, however, began to systematically tear apart this carefully constructed industrial network. The precision of the American raids ensured that not only were factories destroyed, but entire production lines were wiped out in a matter of minutes. These were not just buildings being demolished. The effect was immediate. After each raid, the production capacity of the Nazi war effort took a huge hit. The factory floors, once bustling with workers producing tanks and fighter planes, were now silent. Steel mills, which had produced the armor plating for Tiger tanks, were now reduced to ruins. The intricate assembly lines that had created the powerful Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter aircraft were decimated, and crucial munitions plants that had manufactured shells, bombs, and other war supplies were flattened, leaving Germany with no way to replenish its weapons stockpile. The strategic significance of these factories cannot be overstated. In many ways, they were the beating heart of Germany's military prowess. To destroy these facilities was to strike at the foundation of Nazi power. The idea of attacking factories wasn't just about disrupting production, it was about disrupting the entire framework of the German war effort. Without the factories, Germany could not replace the vehicles, aircraft, and munitions that were lost in battle. What had been a nearly invincible war machine began to crumble under the weight of its own dependency on mass production. To the German High Command, the significance of these bombings was not lost. The loss of a single factory could mean the loss of an entire division's worth of tanks or the depletion of a key supply line for fighter planes. As the war dragged on, the Nazis realized that their ability to wage war was no longer dependent on the strength of their fighting forces alone, but on the productivity of their factories. The faster these facilities were rebuilt or replaced, the longer they could continue the fight. But America's precision bombing raids were relentless, and Germany's efforts to recover were slow and ineffective. In a desperate bid to defend their industrial heartland, the Germans poured resources into anti-aircraft defenses and tried to relocate vital production to underground factories, but the damage had already been done. The once powerful Luftwaffe, once tasked with protecting these strategic sites, was now under pressure on multiple fronts. Their fighters were no longer able to intercept American bombers in sufficient numbers, and the American air superiority was becoming undeniable. For the German soldiers and workers who depended on the constant flow of supplies from these factories, the bombings marked the beginning of the end. They saw the destruction of their factories as a sign of their impending defeat. The power that had once allowed Germany to dominate Europe was no longer a shield, it had become a vulnerability. The loss of industrial capacity not only crippled Germany's ability to sustain its military campaigns, it also shattered the illusion that their war machine was unstoppable. As more factories were destroyed, the reality of their situation set in. The myth of German invincibility, once reinforced by their superior tanks and aircraft, was now being replaced by a harsher truth. Without the infrastructure to support their forces, the war was slipping out of their control. The Allied bombing raids had turned the very symbol of Germany's strength into a symbol of its weakness. The roar of the engines was deafening. Inside the cockpit of the B-17, Captain Frederick W. Castle gripped the controls, his hands steady but his mind racing. This was no longer just a mission. It was a test of precision, of survival. The crew sat in tense silence, each man focused on his role, knowing that a single mistake could cost them everything. The target was a critical munitions factory in the Ruhr Valley, an area crucial to the German war effort. They had done this before, flying deep into enemy territory, bombing industrial centers. But today felt different. The stakes were higher. The Luftwaffe was on alert, and every bomb they dropped could mean the difference between victory and failure. Castle had flown dozens of these missions, but the tension never eased. As the B-17 seconds approached the target, the ground below became a patchwork of fog and smoke, a landscape of devastation that mirrored the war itself. His mind wandered briefly to the faces of the workers in those factories. They didn't know what was coming, but the result of the raid was already decided. The bombers would strike with surgical precision, destroying the heart of Germany's war production. Outside, the sky suddenly erupted with flashes of light. Anti-aircraft fire. Castle's focus sharpened. He could feel the shockwaves from the explosions as his crew scrambled to maintain their course. The rhythmic thump of enemy fire was interrupted by the steady hum of the B-17's engines, but Castle knew they were pushing their luck. Another explosion rocked the bomber, and for a split second, Castle wondered if they would make it. He glanced at his co-pilot, who kept his face grimly neutral. There was no time for fear. There was no time for hesitation. The factory was close now, too close to fail. In the rear, tail gunner Corporal Robert M. James adjusted his position, eyes fixed on the flashing lights below. His job was to protect the bomber from enemy aircraft. The cold of the upper atmosphere pierced through his flight suit, but it wasn't the chill that made him tense, it was the uncertainty. For James, the danger wasn't just in the sky, it was in the unknown. What if the Germans were waiting for them? What if they could intercept the bombers and stop the mission dead in its tracks? As the B-17 dove towards its target, he gripped his weapon, his mind flashing through scenarios, missile attacks, direct hits. His pulse raced, but he knew the drill. The enemy would attack, but it was up to him to ensure that their bombs made it through. That's all that mattered now. In the belly of the plane, Sergeant Thomas W. Kelly, the bombardier, was preparing for the moment he would release the bombs. He checked the sighting system, adjusted the crosshairs, and focused entirely on the target below. As the plane began its final descent, he felt the weight of his responsibility. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the mission would fail. He was the final step in the execution of this plan, and the lives of every man on board depended on his success. The sight of the factory growing larger in the crosshairs gave him an icy clarity. No time for second thoughts, no time for hesitation. He pressed the button, and the first wave of bombs was released. Below, in the ruined heart of the Ruhr Valley, the workers at the factory had no warning. They had spent their days working tirelessly, trying to meet production quotas for the war effort, unaware that their factory was now the target of an incoming storm. In the moments before the bombs fell, there was only the sound of the factory's machinery, the clatter of metal on metal, and the hum of labor. But that was about to change. The first wave of bombs struck with terrifying force. The factory walls shook violently. Workers scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to run. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the deafening sound of explosions was followed by a blinding flash of light. The factory, along with the vital resources it produced, was torn apart in an instant. The blast threw many workers to the ground, disorienting them. Some didn't even have time to scream before the walls of the building came crashing down around them. Outside, the ground began to shake as the B-17 seconds made their way back into the sky. They were gone as quickly as they came, leaving nothing behind but devastation. The factory that had once fueled the Nazi war machine now lay in ruins, its vital production lines silenced forever. As the B-17 seconds made their retreat, the crew didn't celebrate. There was no cheering. There was only the somber knowledge that another strike had been delivered. But the war was far from over. Captain Castle glanced at his crew, all of them lost in their thoughts. The job wasn't done. There were more targets, more factories, more battles to fight. But in that moment, they had taken one more step toward victory. They had delivered a blow to the enemy that they could not quickly recover from. Back at the Luftwaffe headquarters, Major Hans Müller stood at his command post, staring at the radar screen in disbelief. The American bombers had struck again precisely, ruthlessly. The German air defenses had been stretched thin. But this was different. The Americans weren't just attacking military targets. They were targeting the very lifeblood of the Nazi war effort. Müller knew that this attack would not be easily repelled. The Luftwaffe pilots under his command had fought valiantly, but they were being overwhelmed. His thoughts shifted back to the workers who had perished in the bombing, and a sinking feeling spread through him. The realization was dawning. Their industrial base was crumbling, and they could no longer rely on it to supply the weapons necessary for the fight ahead. The silence that followed the raid was deafening. The factory, once a symbol of German strength, was no more. The air was filled with the distant sounds of fire and chaos, but in the quiet of the Luftwaffe headquarters, a heavy sense of defeat began to settle in. The German war machine, once unstoppable, was beginning to grind to a halt. And for the first time, Müller felt the weight of that fact deep in his bones. It was no longer just the loss of a factory. It was the loss of Germany's ability to wage war. The relentless bombing campaigns by the United States were beginning to take a severe toll on Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. The war, which had once been fought with an overwhelming focus on industrial production, now revealed the vulnerability of that very strength. The German military had long relied on its massive industrial capacity to produce weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition at a scale unmatched by most other nations. Factories in the Ruhr Valley, the heart of Germany's industrial machine, were critical to its survival. These factories did not simply produce arms, they were the lifeblood of the Nazi war effort. But by 1945, American precision bombing had started to unravel this system. What had been Germany's greatest strength, its industrial power, was now rapidly becoming its greatest weakness. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a symbol of American air superiority, was specifically designed to target these kinds of industrial hubs. Armed with the ability to deliver precise blows to key factories, rail yards, and oil refineries, the American bombers were changing the course of the war. The bombing campaigns were no longer aimed at random targets or military outposts. They were now surgical strikes, targeting the very factories that produced the tanks, planes, and ammunition needed to sustain the war machine. The effects were immediate and devastating. Each factory destroyed was not just a loss of equipment, it was a crippling blow to Germany's ability to wage war. Factories like the ones in the Ruhr Valley, which had produced the famous Tiger tanks and Luftwaffe aircraft, were key to maintaining military production. As they were bombed into oblivion, the Germans found themselves unable to replace the losses sustained in battle. The once productive factories were reduced to rubble in a matter of hours, with no way to recover quickly enough to support the ongoing conflict. These strikes didn't just disrupt supply chains, they fractured the entire infrastructure that had supported Nazi Germany's military superiority. Meanwhile, on the American side, the precision targeting was not just a stroke of luck, it was the result of months of careful planning and technological advances. The US had perfected its strategic bombing campaigns, developing new techniques and technologies to ensure that their bombs hit their intended targets. These bombers, often escorted by P-51 Mustang fighters, could penetrate deep into German airspace, undeterred by enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft defenses. The efficiency of these raids made it clear that the United States had mastered the art of precision warfare, something the Germans had never anticipated. For the Germans, this was a turning point. The loss of these critical production sites began to have a ripple effect. Germany had been producing a staggering number of weapons and vehicles to fight a multi-front war, but now, with their factories in ruins, the war effort slowed to a crawl. Tanks like the Panther and Tiger, once feared by the Allies for their firepower and armor, were no longer being produced at the rate necessary to replace losses. Aircraft that had dominated the skies in the early years of the war were no longer coming off the assembly lines in the same numbers, and the flow of ammunition to the front lines was becoming inconsistent. As production lines ground to a halt, the German military found itself increasingly unable to mount the kind of offensive operations that had once been their trademark. The Luftwaffe, Germany's once proud air force, was especially vulnerable. It had long been a symbol of Germany's military strength, but with the factories producing its aircraft now under constant threat, the Luftwaffe found itself increasingly outnumbered. The loss of aircraft production was compounded by the inability to replace skilled personnel. German pilots, who had once been seen as the best in the world, were now finding themselves facing waves of American bombers, each raid more devastating than the last. The Luftwaffe's defenses, already stretched thin, were no match for the precision of the American raids. As German fighters scrambled to intercept, they were met not only by bombers, but also by the superior firepower of American escort fighters, which wiped them out in dogfights above the battlefield. The shift in Germany's military capabilities was felt not only in the skies but also on the ground. The inability to replace lost tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles meant that German soldiers had fewer resources to continue their fight. The once feared German panzer divisions, which had rolled across Europe in the early years of the war, were now struggling to keep up. With fewer reinforcements arriving from the factories, their power was gradually diminished, and their ability to wage large-scale battles was severely hampered. At the same time, the Americans were enjoying the fruits of their industrial advantage. While Germany struggled to keep its factories running, the United States' own production capabilities were in full swing. Factories across America were cranking out planes, tanks, and ammunition at an unprecedented rate. The American war machine was not just surviving, it was thriving. Unlike the Germans, the U.S. was able to replace lost equipment faster than it could be destroyed on the battlefield. This advantage would become increasingly apparent in the months that followed, as the Allies continued their advance across Europe. For the German High Command, the realization that they were losing the war on the industrial front was a bitter pill to swallow. The war had been, in many ways, a battle of industrial power. Whoever could produce the most weapons, the most tanks, the most planes, would ultimately win. In this war of attrition, Germany was beginning to lose the race. The destruction of their factories wasn't just a temporary setback, it was a fatal blow that would take months, if not years, to recover from. By 1945, the writing was on the wall. The American bombing raids had not only crippled Germany's ability to produce the tools of war, they had broken the will of the German people to continue the fight. The realization that their military machine was no longer capable of sustaining its operations led to a profound shift in strategy. The Germans could no longer focus on fighting their enemies on the front lines. They had to deal with the growing pressure on their industrial base. But by the time they realized the depth of their vulnerability, it was too late. The Allies had already gained the upper hand, and the destruction of Germany's industrial heart was a key factor in the inevitable collapse of the Nazi regime. The once unshakable confidence of the German military was starting to crumble. The Tiger tanks, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were no longer the feared beasts of war they had been. Once, they had swept through enemy lines, their 88mm guns tearing apart anything in their path. Now, in the face of American precision strikes, they were being outmaneuvered and destroyed by the very tactics they had once mocked. The American Sherman Firefly, smaller but faster, with its 17-pounder gun, had found its mark. The Tigers, once untouchable, were now no match for the speed and flexibility of the Allies' new tactics. For the Germans, the realization hit hard: what had been their greatest asset was now a liability. The Luftwaffe, too, had once been a symbol of German dominance in the skies. Its pilots, revered and feared by the world, had ruled the air with their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But the bombers were coming, and they came in waves. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the symbol of American air superiority, had proven to be an unstoppable force. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and struggling to maintain control, was being overwhelmed. Even their best pilots could no longer keep up with the Americans' precision and firepower. The sky, once their domain, was now a battleground they could not win. And then there were the U-boats, which had once stalked the Atlantic, cutting off Allied supplies and striking fear into the hearts of merchant ships. For years, they had been the unsung heroes of the German Navy, their stealth and deadly torpedoes crippling entire convoys. But now, with the rise of American sonar and the devastating effectiveness of the Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon, the U-boats had become obsolete. They could no longer strike from the shadows without being detected. The myth of the invincible U-boat fleet was shattered, its power diminished by the very technology the Germans had failed to counter. It was in these moments that the true weight of defeat began to sink in. The German High Command had long placed its faith in its technological superiority, its tanks, its planes, its submarines. These were the weapons that would bring victory, they had been told. But now, with their industrial heart shattered and their once vaunted weapons rendered ineffective, the Germans were facing a new reality. Their once mighty war machine was no longer capable of holding the line. In the ruins of their factories, where the smell of burning steel lingered in the air, the reality was undeniable. The factories that had once churned out the machines of war were now in ashes. The symbols of German might, the Tiger tanks, the Luftwaffe's dominance, the U-boats, were no longer enough to keep the war machine running. The myth of German superiority, built on the strength of its weapons, was collapsing. For the soldiers on the front lines, the realization was equally painful. They had been fighting with pride, believing in the invincibility of their tanks and planes, their weapons, and their training. But now, as they faced the relentless tide of American production and air raids, they understood that their once unstoppable force had been outproduced, outmaneuvered, and outclassed. The enemy was not just defeating them on the battlefield, they were dismantling the very foundation of their military power. The silence that followed each raid was deafening. There were no cries of victory, no cheers, just the sound of crumbling steel, the distant hum of B-17 seconds retreating into the horizon, and the quiet resignation of a once proud army that had lost its edge. The myths that had sustained Germany for so long, the belief that they could never be defeated, were now shattered. The war had changed, and with it, the very future of Nazi Germany. As the bombers returned to base, the devastation left behind in the Ruhr Valley was impossible to ignore. The factories that had once symbolized German industrial supremacy were now smoking ruins. The loss was not just in the destruction of steel, concrete, and machinery, but in the collapse of an entire way of waging war. The Allies had attacked the very foundation of Nazi Germany, and with each factory destroyed, the ability to fight back grew weaker. In the wake of the raids, the High Command in Berlin was left scrambling. There was no longer any certainty that they could replace the losses. The war was grinding to a halt, not because of enemy tanks or aircraft, but because Germany simply couldn't produce enough of them anymore. The technological advancements, the superweapons that had once been their greatest pride, now stood impotent without the industrial base to support them. For the soldiers on the front lines, the reality was clear. Without the constant flow of new tanks, new weapons, new ammunition, they were fighting a losing battle. The German army, once a juggernaut that had swept through Europe, was now a desperate force, clinging to whatever they could scrape together. The myth of invincibility had been shattered, and what remained was the cold truth: they were running out of time. In the distance, the sound of Allied engines filled the air once more, a reminder that the war was far from over. But for the German military, the battle was no longer just against enemy forces, it was against the collapse of their entire war machine. And as the skies above the Ruhr Valley cleared, the silence of destruction set in. The end was closer than anyone had dared to imagine. How much longer could they hold on without the tools to fight? How many more raids would it take to shatter the final illusions of victory? The answers would come in the days ahead. But one thing was certain: the world had irrevocably changed.